The sun was bright, and the air was warm when Thomas shuffled into the car lot. He wore his old jacket faded at the seams and a pair of work boots that had seen better days. The salesman standing by the shiny row of cars glanced at him and then quickly looked away. One of them whispered something to another, and both laughed quietly. Thomas walked slowly along the line of vehicles, his eyes landing on a sleek red sports car that gleamed in the sunlight. He touched the hood gently, almost reverently, as though remembering something from his younger years. A salesman finally approached him, with a forced smile that barely hid his irritation. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, though his tone suggested he did not expect to. Thomas nodded his head. "Yes, I would like to know more about this car," he said softly. The salesman smirked and crossed his arms. "That one is a bit out of your range, sir. Maybe you should check the used section in the back." The words stung, but Thomas did not argue. He simply gave a small nod and stepped back. Another salesman joined in, chuckling loud enough for him to hear. "We get all kinds here," he said. "Sometimes people just want to dream." Thomas looked at them, his eyes calm but unreadable. "I see," he murmured, and slowly walked away, leaving the salesman laughing behind his back. They thought the matter was over, just another poor man wandering through their lot with no business being there. But Thomas had left with more resolve than before. He had not been poor his whole life. He had worked hard, built his business from the ground up, and even though he looked worn down, his spirit had not faded. The next day, the sound of an engine roared down the street. Heads turned as a matte black Lamborghini pulled up in front of the same dealership. The doors lifted, and out stepped Thomas, the same old jacket on his shoulders, but a quiet fire in his eyes. Every salesman froze, jaws slack, as they realized who it was. Thomas walked calmly toward them, his boots striking the pavement with purpose. He did not rush. He wanted them to see every step he took and remember every word they had spoken the day before. "Would you like me to continue?" The moment when Thomas confronts the salesman and reveal what he says to them. Thomas stopped in front of the two salesmen who had laughed at him the day before. Their smiles had vanished, and now their faces were pale with shock. Thomas looked from one to the other, then rested his hand on the roof of the Lamborghini. "This car is mine," he said calmly. "I bought it yesterday from a dealership across town." He let the words sink in before he continued. "They treated me with respect, though they listened when I spoke." The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, unable to respond. Thomas took a step closer, his voice still calm but sharper now. "Yesterday, I asked you a simple question about a car. I never said I could not afford it. I never said I was just dreaming, but you decided what I was worth based on what you saw." The other salesmen on the lot had gathered, now watching silently as Thomas spoke. One of the men tried to stammer out an apology. "Sir, we didn't mean it like that." Thomas cut him off. "You meant exactly what you said. You judged me because of how I looked." He gestured to the Lamborghini. "The dealership that sold me this car will now have my loyalty for life, and every one of my friends and family will hear about the way you treated me." The manager hurried out of the office, clearly alarmed. He plastered on a wide smile. "Mr. Thomas, please forgive my staff. I'm sure this was all a misunderstanding." Thomas turned his gaze on him, steady and unflinching. "I do not need your excuses. I came back today not for your forgiveness, but to make sure your staff remembers this lesson for the rest of their careers." The lot was quiet except for the hum of the Lamborghini engine still idling. Thomas looked around at every face, then slowly shook his head. "You never know who you are speaking to, and you never know what they are capable of." He opened the car door, the sleek machine waiting for him. The salesmen could do nothing but stand frozen, their arrogance stripped away as Thomas lowered himself into the seat. "Do you want me to continue with how Thomas leaves the lot and how the onlookers react to him driving away?" Thomas settled into the leather seat of the Lamborghini, and the quiet purr of the engine grew louder as he pressed the accelerator lightly. The polished hood reflected the stunned faces of the salesmen who had mocked him only a day before. Without another word, Thomas eased the car forward, and the sound of the engine echoed across the lot, commanding attention from every corner. Some customers stopped in their tracks, staring at the gleaming machine as it rolled past them. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering in awe, "Dad, look at that car." Thomas caught the boy's gaze and gave him a small nod, a gesture of encouragement that made the child beam with excitement. As he turned toward the exit, Thomas could see the manager still frozen in place, his smile gone, his expression now one of quiet dread. He knew word of this moment would spread quickly among the staff, and perhaps even further. Thomas guided the car onto the main road, the power of the engine pushing him smoothly forward. With every mile, he felt the weight of the humiliation he had endured the previous day fall further behind him. This drive was not about showing off, it was about reclaiming his dignity in front of those who had tried to take it from him. The wind rushed past his window as he accelerated, the roar of the engine drowning out the memory of their laughter. But deep inside, Thomas knew this was only the beginning of something greater. He had lived his life modestly, never feeling the need to flaunt what he had, but now he realized that sometimes standing tall required more than quiet patience. Sometimes people needed to be reminded that worth could not be measured by appearance. The Lamborghini gleamed in the sunlight as he drove on, its reflection a symbol of the truth he had just delivered. Do you want me to continue with what happens when Thomas decides to return home and how his family reacts to seeing him in the Lamborghini? Thomas drove down the winding country road that led back to his home, the engine humming steadily beneath him. Neighbors glanced up as the bright Lamborghini passed their houses, some of them blinking in disbelief. A few even waved, unsure if it was really Thomas behind the wheel of such a powerful machine. When he pulled into his driveway, his daughter Emily was already standing on the porch, her eyes wide with shock. "Dad, is that really yours?" she called out, her voice filled with excitement. Thomas stepped out of the car and smiled. "Yes, Emily, it is mine. I picked it up yesterday." She ran toward him, nearly tripping on the steps before throwing her arms around him. "Dad, I can't believe this. I thought you said you were just going to look." Thomas chuckled softly. But sometimes life gives you a chance to prove people wrong, and I decided to take it." His wife Margaret appeared at the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression a mix of surprise and pride. "Thomas, you never told me you were buying something like this," she said, shaking her head. "I wanted to keep it quiet until I was sure," Thomas replied, "but after what happened yesterday, I knew I had to." Emily circled the Lamborghini carefully, her fingers hovering just above the gleaming surface. "Dad, this is incredible. The color, the shine, everything about it." Thomas looked at her with a smile. "Remember, Emily, it is not the car that matters, it is the lesson behind it. Never let anyone decide your worth based on how you look." Margaret nodded slowly, watching her husband with admiration. "You taught them something they will never forget." The sound of another car pulling up caught their attention, and Thomas turned to see a familiar face arriving at the edge of his driveway. It was his old friend Daniel, who had heard stories about what happened at the car lot. Daniel stepped out of his truck, whistling low as his eyes landed on the Lamborghini. "Thomas, the first heard a rumor, but I did not believe it until now." Thomas grinned. "I thought you might come by once the news spread." Daniel shook his head in amazement. "What did you say to those men after what they did yesterday?" Thomas looked back at the Lamborghini, then at his friend and family. He said nothing at first, letting the moment hang in the air. Do you want me to continue with how Thomas shares the full story of what happened at the dealership and how his family and Daniel react to it? Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm but steady. "I told them respect should never depend on what someone wears or drives. I reminded them that the way they treat people today can decide whether those people return tomorrow." Daniel crossed his arms, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Sounds like you left them speechless." Thomas nodded. "They had nothing left to say. Their manager tried to cover it up, but I made sure they understood that their behavior cost them more than a sale, it cost them their reputation." Emily leaned against the car, still wide-eyed. "Dad, they must have been so embarrassed." Thomas chuckled lightly. "They were, Emily, but embarrassment fades. The lesson I wanted to leave with them will stay longer." Margaret stepped closer, resting her hand on his arm. "And what about you, Thomas? How did it feel when you finally drove away from that place?" Thomas looked down for a moment, then back up, his eyes clear. "It felt like freedom. I was not driving away in a car. I was driving away from the weight of their judgment." Daniel let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "You always had a way of turning things around, my friend. Those men will never forget the day an old man they mocked pulled up in a car they could only dream of." Thomas smiled, but there was no boast in his expression, only a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had turned their arrogance into a lesson. The late afternoon sun glinted off the Lamborghini, casting long shadows across the driveway. The car stood as a silent witness to everything Thomas had endured and everything he had overcome. Emily looked up at her father again, her voice softer this time. "Dad, can I ride with you sometime?" Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. "Of course you can, Emily. But remember, this is not just a car, it is a reminder of what we should never forget. Daniel tilted his head toward the road. I have a feeling more folks are going to come by just to see this. You might be the talk of the town for a while. Thomas gave a small laugh. Maybe so, but if they come I will tell them the same story. Respect people for who they are, not for what they look like. The hum of the Lamborghini still lingered in the air as the three of them stood there together, the weight of the moment wrapping around them like a quiet promise of something greater yet to come. Do you want me to continue with how more neighbors start noticing and gathering around Thomas' house, curious about the Lamborghini and the story behind it? It did not take long before the first neighbor appeared at the edge of the driveway. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street slowly walked over, her eyes fixed on the gleaming Lamborghini. My goodness, Thomas, is that really yours? She asked in disbelief. Thomas gave her a polite nod. Yes, it is mine. I picked it up yesterday. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head with a smile. I never would have expected it, but I must say it suits you perfectly. Before long, more neighbors began arriving, drawn by the sight of the rare machine sitting in front of Thomas' house. Some came on foot, others slowed their cars as they passed, all of them curious about how the quiet man they had known for years suddenly had such a powerful car. Daniel leaned closer to Thomas with a chuckle. Looks like the whole street is going to show up at this rate. Emily giggled, a little embarrassed by the growing attention. Dad, you're going to cause traffic. Thomas smiled softly. Let them come. It is not about the car, it is about the story behind it. One of the younger neighbors, a teenager named Ryan, stepped forward, his eyes wide in awe. Sir, is that a Lamborghini Huracan? Thomas nodded. That is right, Ryan. Ryan grinned ear to ear. That is the coolest thing I have ever seen. Thomas placed a hand on the car roof and spoke to the small crowd gathering around. This car came after a lesson, not before it. Yesterday, I was turned away from a dealership because they judged me by the way I looked. They laughed at me, but today I came back with this not to show off, but to remind them and anyone who hears the story that respect should never be given or denied based on appearances. The neighbors grew quiet, listening to his words. The reflection of the evening sun danced across the polished surface of the Lamborghini like a spotlight on the truth he had just spoken. Margaret stood beside him, her pride evident as she looked out at the gathering faces. The small crowd nodded slowly, some murmuring in agreement, others clearly inspired by what they had just heard. Thomas rested his hand on Emily's shoulder, then looked out at the neighbors again. You never know who someone really is or what they have been through. That is why you treat everyone with kindness. Do you want me to continue with how the neighbors spread the story of Thomas' lesson through the town, making him a quiet legend in the community? Word of Thomas and his Lamborghini spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next morning, people were whispering about it in the local diner and at the grocery store. Some spoke about the car itself, but most spoke about the story that came with it. The old man dismissed at a car lot who returned in style to prove a point. At the town square, a few of the younger residents gathered near the coffee shop, telling the tale with wide gestures and hushed excitement. One man laughed softly. He showed them, all right, they thought he was just some poor old guy, and now they will never forget him. Back at home, Thomas noticed the curious glances from passers-by as they slowed their cars or stopped mid-walk to stare at the Lamborghini parked proudly in his driveway. Emily sat on the porch watching them with amusement. Dad, you are like a celebrity now. Thomas smiled but shook his head quietly. Celebrities chase attention. Emily, this attention found me. I only hope the lesson spreads further than the shine of this car. Margaret agreed softly. It already has. Thomas, people are repeating what you said about respect. I heard Mrs. Jenkins telling her friend about it this morning at the market. Daniel stopped by again, leaning on the porch, railing with a grin. You are becoming a legend, my friend. The story is growing faster than wildfire. Thomas looked thoughtful. Legends fade, Daniel, but if the message remains, then it will all have been worth it. Later that afternoon, Thomas decided to take the Lamborghini for another drive through town. Heads turned as he cruised down Main Street. Shopkeepers paused at their doors and children pointed in awe. But Thomas kept his focus steady. He was not there to flaunt, he was there to remind each person who asked him about the car that dignity and kindness should never be judged by outward appearances. Some people nodded with admiration, others looked ashamed, as if recalling times when they had judged someone unfairly. By the time he pulled back into his driveway, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Emily hurried down the steps as he parked. Did anyone say anything to you, Dad? Thomas gave her a gentle smile. Only questions, Emily, but I answered each one with the truth. Do you want me to continue with how the dealership hears about the spreading story and tries to reach out to Thomas? The next morning, Thomas was sipping his coffee on the porch when the phone rang inside the house. Margaret answered it, and after a moment, she stepped out holding the receiver, her expression curious. Thomas, it is the dealership, the one that turned you away. Thomas raised an eyebrow, then set down his mug. He took the phone slowly, his voice calm as he spoke. This is Thomas. The manager on the other end cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Thomas the First, have been hearing some stories around town about your visit to our lot yesterday. I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the way you were treated. Thomas listened without a word, the silence making the manager stumble through more excuses. The manager continued, we value all our customers, and I can assure you that the staff members involved will be disciplined. We would also like to offer you complimentary service on your new vehicle. Thomas finally spoke, his tone steady. I did not share my story for free oil changes or apologies. I shared it so your staff and others like them would learn respect that is worth more than any service you can offer me. There was a long pause on the line before the manager answered quietly, I understand, sir. Thomas nodded once, though the man could not see him. Then I hope you truly do. After ending the call, Thomas stepped back onto the porch. Margaret and Emily were watching him closely. Emily asked softly, what did they want, Dad? Thomas smiled faintly. They wanted to smooth things over, but some things cannot be smoothed away with gifts or offers, only with real change. Daniel arrived not long after, pulling into the driveway with his usual grin. Well, I heard the dealership is in a bit of panic. Seems like they underestimated who they were dealing with. Thomas chuckled, lightly perhaps, but if it makes them think twice the next time someone walks onto their lot, then it was worth every moment. As they spoke, more neighbors strolled by, nodding or waving at Thomas. Some even stopped to shake his hand, thanking him for reminding the town of a lesson that felt too often forgotten. Thomas accepted their words with humility, never letting pride creep into his voice. The Lamborghini remained parked nearby, gleaming in the sun, no longer just a car, but a symbol that appearances could not define a person's worth. Do you want me to continue with how the local news catches wind of the story and wants to feature Thomas and his lesson? It was only a matter of time before the story reached beyond the neighborhood. 2 days later, a local reporter knocked on Thomas' door, notebook in hand and a cameraman waiting at the sidewalk. Sir, the reporter began politely, we have been hearing about what happened at the dealership and how you returned the next day in a Lamborghini. Would you be willing to share your story with the community? Thomas stood in the doorway, silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. If it helps people understand the importance of respect, then yes, I will speak. They set up the camera by the driveway, the Lamborghini gleaming behind him as the perfect backdrop. The reporter asked, how did it feel to be dismissed so quickly and then to come back in a car like this? Thomas looked into the lens, his voice calm but steady. It felt like a reminder of how often we judge people without knowing their story. They looked at me and saw someone unworthy of their time. What they failed to see was a man who had worked hard his entire life, a man who did not need their approval to prove his worth. The cameraman glanced up from his viewfinder, clearly moved by the sincerity in Thomas' words. The reporter pressed on, and what do you want people to take away from this? Thomas replied, respect is free. It costs nothing to treat people with dignity, whether they wear old shoes or new ones, whether they walk onto a lot or drive up in a beat-up truck. You treat them the same, because you never know who they are or what they carry within them. Margaret and Emily stood to the side, watching proudly as Thomas spoke his truth, not for fame, but for the lesson. Daniel leaned against the porch railing, a small smile tugging at his lips. This will spread far beyond our town, he muttered quietly. When the interview aired later that evening, Thomas' phone began to ring with calls from friends he had not spoken to in years. People from across the county reached out, praising his words. The next day, strangers passing through town stopped by just to shake his hand, some even asking for photos, not with the Lamborghini, but with the man who had reminded them of something simple and powerful. The once quiet old man had now become a voice people wanted to hear, yet Thomas carried himself the same way, calm, steady, and humble. He still rose early for coffee on the porch, still waved at neighbors, still drove the Lamborghini, only when he wished to enjoy the road, never as a trophy. But the world around him was beginning to change, one conversation at a time. Do you want me to continue with how Thomas' story starts reaching beyond the local news and attracts attention from bigger outlets and even businesses wanting to feature him? Soon, Thomas' story reached far beyond the borders of his little town. Regional news outlets picked it up, then national programs followed. People everywhere were talking about the poor-looking old man dismissed at a dealership who drove back the next day in a Lamborghini and left behind a lesson that money could never buy. Letters began arriving at his home from strangers thanking him for speaking out. Some shared their own experiences of being judged unfairly and how his words gave them the courage to stand taller. Emily sat with him each evening, reading through the messages, her eyes lighting up with pride. "Dad, you have touched more people than you realize." Margaret smiled gently at her husband. "You have always been this man, Thomas. The world just finally saw it too." Despite the attention, Thomas' life did not change in the way some expected. He did not chase interviews or bask in the fame. Instead, he continued to live quietly, reminding those around him through his actions that respect and kindness were what mattered most. The Lamborghini remained in his driveway, but to Thomas it was no longer just a car. It was a symbol of a lesson carried across hearts and towns, a reminder of the day arrogance was silenced and dignity triumphed. On warm evenings, he would still sit on his porch sipping coffee as the sun set over the horizon. Neighbors waved as they passed, and sometimes children pointed at the shining car, but what lingered most was not the machine itself. It was the man beside it, the one who had proven that worth could never be judged by appearances. And so Thomas carried on his days, steady and humble, a quiet legend, not because of the Lamborghini, but because of the truth he had lived and shared with the world.